Okay, so why don't we start by offering our blessing for immersing ourselves in Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu לעסוק בדברי תורה, החוכמה, לעסוק בדברי תורה, ידעי די 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 די, ידעי די 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 די, ידעי די 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 די, ידעי די די די. So we are going to delve into this week's Torah portion, which is Vayera. Vayera happens to have an enormous amount of material as part of it, including the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, including the story of the Akedah, where Abraham nearly sacrifices his son, including a lot of things going on between Sarah and Hagar, circumcision, the birth of the Jewish people. In so many ways, this Torah portion just holds so much of our Jewish people's beginning. But today, the focus is really on enthusiasm. Because that is the midah, or the soul trait, that is our focus this week. So I want to start just at the very, very beginning of the portion with Genesis 18. And this, of course, was referenced in the Torah commentary early on as well. Would anyone like to read these verses? I can make them a little bigger.
Well, I will.
Thank you, Jessica.
The Lord appeared to him by the terebinths of Mamre. He was sitting at the entrance of the tent as the day grew hot. Looking up, he saw 3 men standing near him. As soon as he saw them, he ran from the entrance of the tent to greet them. And bowing to the ground, he said, "My lords, if it please you, do not go on past your servant. Let a little water be brought, bathe your feet, and recline under the tree. And let me fetch a morsel of bread that you may refresh yourselves. Then go on, seeing that you have come your servant's way." They replied, "Do as you have said." Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah and said, "Quick, 3 seahs of choice flour, knead and make cakes." Then Abraham ran to the herd, took a calf, tender and choice, and gave it to a servant boy, who hastened to prepare it. He took curds and milk and the calf that had been prepared and set these before them, and he waited on them under the tree as they ate. Oh, excuse me.
Labriut. Thank you so much.
On the Torah.
Well, you sneeze on the truth, right? So the Torah portion begins with this immediate action, right? He sees, Abraham, or Abram at this point, sees the people. He sees 3 men standing near him. And as soon as he saw them, he ran from the entrance to the tent to greet them. And we see in the Hebrew as well, I bolded it for anyone who would like to, Vayera v'yara'at. He saw and he ran. That's how quick the Hebrew goes. So in other words, he responded immediately. He saw people who were strangers, and before he could even think about it, he was up and he was running to go and greet them. That's the kind of enthusiasm that we're talking about in this Torah portion. That's the focal point. Sorry about that. And to add even more to that, the verses that precede the verses that we read where Abraham runs are verses that talk about what had happened just beforehand. Would anyone like to read this? Thanks, Larry. You're muted. Can you unmute first?
Yes, thank you. Then Abraham took his son Ishmael and all his homeborn slaves and all those he had bought, every male in Abram's household, and he circumcised the flesh of the foreskins on that very day, as God had spoken to him. Abram was 99 years old when he circumcised the flesh of his foreskin, and his son Ishmael was 13 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. Thus Abram and his son Ishmael were circumcised on that very day, and all his household, his homeborn slaves, and those that had been bought from outsiders were circumcised with him.
Thank you. So essentially, he had just been circumcised, right? And indeed, in our portion for today, he writes, Abraham is shown as rushing to fulfill the mitzvah of hachnasat orchim, or welcoming guests. Immediately prior to the arrival of these strangers, Abraham is found sitting in the heat of the day, convalescing from his brit milah, that is, in a weakened and diminished emotional and physical state, because he had just been circumcised. So it wasn't that he saw strangers and he got up and he went on any random day. He was still recovering from being circumcised, and he still ran with that kind of alacrity. When he looks up and he sees the approaching strangers, he harnesses all of his energy and rushes out to meet them, caring only for their comfort. It is taught, Gedola haknasat orchim mekabalat penei hashchina. Greater is hospitality than even welcoming the divine presence. Abraham makes the priority of enthusiastically fulfilling this mitzvah of hachnasat orchim, audacious hospitality, to its completion. Water, food, and shelter from the blistering heat are immediately and generously provided. In return, a message of good news is delivered by the strangers. Abraham and Sarah learn that after many years of infertility, the promise will come to fruition, and Sarah will birth the promise and much anticipated child, Isaac. So what do you make of this, of what Abraham does here? Any responses or thoughts on that?
He circumcised Ishmael.
Yes.
I think that's a big thing.
Yeah, and also at 99 years old, he circumcised himself. Wow. Later on, when Reuben circumcises strangers who have taken Dinah, they're so weakened that they can be killed. This is incredible. 99 years old to cut the foreskin with a rock of some type.
Well, maybe at that age, it didn't hurt so much. You know.
Well, maybe they didn't have cataracts at that time, but even at 69 rather than 99, it might be hard to see to do all those circumcisions. Oh, goodness.
Cataracts are easier than circumcising.
Especially all those men.
Yeah. You know, I wanted to be really open and honest with this particular midah, because I quite frankly am struggling with it. I don't mind the notion of enthusiasm. In fact, I think it's really a wonderful attribute. And I think it has meaning for those people who are the recipients of another person's enthusiasm. That being said, I feel, and what I hope to learn today and change my mind about, is this lack of being responsible. He could have bled to death, for example. In his enthusiasm to be warm and audaciously hospitable, he could have harmed himself. And when I'm thinking about it, as we learn about the other instances perhaps today, I saw that over and over again, this quickness to respond, this lack of thinking first and then acting. So I'm hoping to change my mind and learn about this midah more.
I think there's one word to think about, Abraham may be intoxicated with everything, intoxicated with God, intoxicated with responsibility. He just is overwhelmed with that sense of being with God, intoxicated with God. So think about that as we go forth.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're bringing up a really, really important point here, and it's related to all of the midot, right? That too much or too little can cause problems, right? Maybe this overzealousness, that the enthusiasm itself was a great thing, but perhaps if this midrash is true, and he went straight from circumcising himself into running and enthusiastically greeting people, perhaps that actually wasn't appropriate. And what we kind of wrestle with, all of these midot are meant for us to wrestle with them, because if we go too far, there's a problem. And if we also don't embrace the midah at all, there's a problem. If we have no enthusiasm and excitement in our life, that's not such a good thing either. So it's where the balance is, and it might be a little bit different for all of us.
Maybe it's a pickup.
They don't go in.
So
too much.
maybe it's a pickup from where we were last week when we talked about trust.
Say more about that.
Well, this is God or God's representatives, or his desire and his overwhelming desire to welcome the people. Maybe that was just trust that he would be able to do it, that that's what he's supposed to do, and therefore he would be able to do it. So I never noticed before that it said, and Ishmael was 13. We never bring that up when we talk about days and the importance of 13.
Yeah, it's true.
That doesn't besides naming them, it doesn't really go into them, and then all of a sudden they have this be able to see into the future and the birth of Isaac. I guess this is the first time they're learning that this is going to happen, and these are strangers. You know, am I making a mistake here?
Well, they're actually angels, but he thought that they were strangers.
Oh, okay, all right.
Yeah, I didn't bring in the whole text because we're kind of skipping all over the place today. So I'm really glad you asked that question, Irv. Otherwise, I'm sure there'll be many other people who are confused because of that omission. So speaking of other texts, I'm going to jump straight into another one, which also has a similar kind of a feeling of jumping into something. And we'll see how we feel about this one. So this is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And you'll notice, by the way, that the one that we just spoke to was the very beginning of chapter 18. That was this text about him greeting people. Sodom and Gomorrah, sorry if all this moving is making anyone dizzy, I apologize, is just a few verses later. So everything goes super fast in this Torah portion. It really is chock full of stuff. Does anyone want to read these verses?
I can read.
Oh, go ahead.
Tammy, why don't you read this one, and Irv, if you'll read the next one, that'd be wonderful.
Okay.
Then the Lord said, the outrage of Sodom and Gomorrah is so great and their sin so grave, I will go down to see whether they have acted altogether according to the outcry that has reached me. If not, I will take note. The men went on from there to Sodom, while Abraham remained standing before the Lord. Abraham came forward and said, will you sweep away the innocent along with the guilty? What if there should be 50 innocent within the city? Will you then wipe out the place and not forgive it for the sake of the innocent 50 who are in it?
Thank you for reading it. And you'll notice that I bolded these particular words. And the Hebrew of those words is interesting. For anyone who, I'm trying to see if there are people in my intro class who are also here, because we talked a little bit about this on Sunday. The words are Vayigash Avraham, which means like Abraham met, but actually because this word appears in other verses to talk about prayer, it actually could mean that basically Abraham began to pray fervently to God. And that actually was what was going on. But the way that it's written is it's immediate. It's an immediate response. That God is thinking this through. Abraham finds out and immediately says, hey, what are you doing? No, we should not kill people if there's anyone who is innocent and who is, righteous within the community.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
are we to assume that somewhere between the end of verse 22 and the beginning of 23, God spoke to Abraham somehow? I
Right.
wonder
We don't know.
Oh.
Exactly. We don't even know what God said. It's left out, right? That's the white fire. Right. The text is the black fire. That's the white fire. We don't even know. But it's almost like it's so immediate that it doesn't even need to say that God says it. God is thinking of it. Abraham is standing there, and all of a sudden Abraham says, will you really do this? The second he finds out, there we go.
So God was already there, because that is when when Sarah finds out that she's going to have this child, right? So God,
Yes.
it doesn't say in the text, and God came along as well.
Right.
So all of a sudden, God is there. We could say God is always everywhere.
Certainly. But what do we make of the enthusiastic response that Abraham has in this case? Do we feel differently about it than we do with the story of welcoming the strangers?
He's arguing with God not to take innocent lives. They may be terrible people there, but are you going to take the decent people along with them just because you're angry? It's not the first time this has happened. Argument with God about what he was thinking about doing to people.
Actually, this is really the first significant time that there is an argument with God.
Oh, I got out of sequence. We're back at the beginning. I'm sorry.
Yeah, exactly. We are right back at the beginning, and it takes a lot of chutzpah to do what Abraham is doing. And in particular, some of the words that he uses are very, very pointed. For example, I didn't include this line, but yes, I did. It's in 23, where where is it?
Will you sweep away the innocent along with the guilty?
No, I'm trying to see where the translation is, but the words are Chalila Lacha, which means God forbid that you do such a thing, God. So it's very chutzpahdik that Abraham used words toward God at this point. But do we feel like that the enthusiasm that he uses to argue that it's appropriate in this case?
It's will not the judge of all the earth do justice? Is that the one you're looking at? That's Alter's translation. I have here.
Yes, I was trying to see the Hebrew
verse
text
25,
quickly.
I think.
Oh, you know what? That's why I'm not seeing it, because this piece only went up to 24. That would explain it. Yes, you're right.
Well, if Abraham is, God chooses Abraham for go someplace to do something and have a lot of children and of offspring for many generations. So this is the first time Abraham really stands up for his people, good or bad. He stands up for human beings, for humanity, as it were, at least in this one place. And we do not see that before, and not that often actually afterwards.
Yeah.
Can I ask a quick question? It's been troubling me for a long time.
Of course.
Sodom and Gomorrah are two locations, right? But Gomorrah is also used in a text like Mishnah and Gomorrah. Is it the same word, or is it relating to that place Gomorrah? I've studied Gomorrah, but is it Is it two meanings? I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's two separate things. It's Gomorrah instead of Gomorrah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I actually hadn't made that connection myself, but I completely and totally understand why you would. Trying to find it in the Hebrew just to kind of show it.
Just been something since childhood that I could never connect. Nobody to ask. Thank you.
Here, look, it's actually the Amorah is how it's written in the Hebrew.
Okay.
Wasn't the ayin once vocalized down in the
Yes.
throat like a like almost like a G, like a G?
Yeah.
Things you learn.
Okay, so I want to just bring in one or a couple of other texts, but like we see how there's a difference here, that perhaps in some cases enthusiasm actually is really warranted and needed. If Abraham had paused and not spoken up, God could have destroyed the people while he was thinking about it. But he stood up and responded immediately to try to get God to change. And perhaps sometimes that enthusiasm is not only warranted, but actually 100% required. Whereas other times, maybe taking that moment, like Marla pointed out, to actually think something through could be far more like appropriate. Let me just see. Does this relate to the memo? Karen, I'd love you to kind of vocalize what you put in the chat a little bit so we can talk through that. It's a really interesting question.
I just came in as Marla was talking about Abraham, like having basically had surgery and like welcoming the stranger, which is, I know, something that is commanded, but like giving so much of oneself that you're putting yourself at risk. I know, like in parenting classes, they always talk about like, make sure you take care of your foundation, and so that you can take care of other people, you know, take care of yourself first, so that that is there to give you a position of strength. And I wonder if that was relating to what Marla was saying a bit.
Yeah.
So what the thing that I was referring to is Congresswoman Alicia, I'm sorry, many names.
Ocasio-Cortez, yeah.
Yes, Ocasio-Cortez. She, I guess, put out on her.
I had something that popped up. I apologize.
No worries. She had a memo that she sent out, and people were thinking, oh, I'm getting another fundraising thing from somebody. And it was a 2-pager that basically talked about burnout and how it happens. And part of what she talked about is certain, especially women and people that come from different ethnic and different sorts of backgrounds, sometimes give so much of themselves because it's ingrained. It's to try to meet and exceed expectations. They give so much of themselves that not much is left for themselves at all. So, and it creates burnout. So, sorry, I missed the very beginning of this discussion. So what I have to say probably has no relation to anything.
No, it has a lot of relation to what we're talking about.
Oh, good. Okay.
Yeah.
Contributing.
Because there's this whole, I mean, there's this whole idea with all of these different soul traits that when you go too far, too much of a good thing is a bad thing, right? And so Abraham is connected to two different things. He is connected to this idea of enthusiasm, and he's connected to chesed, which is like love and giving of himself. But what it said is that because he is so much those things, sometimes he gives to a fault. And it's actually not healthy. And that he's a model for that. And then his son is a model for something else. And the hope is that we can get those things and find balance in our lives. Because if we give too much, that's exactly what happens. What you were talking about, Karen. So very, very, very appropriate.
Oh, good. I feel like I contributed to something today.
You definitely did. Rabbi Catherine, did you want to say something?
No, I'm just agreeing along with with this whole thing. And I know it's a point that is made a little bit further in the Torah commentary as well.
Yeah, and we're going to get to a bunch of other texts that speak to that for sure. I feel like whenever we do Musar, it's important to bring in Alan Marinas because he is such a wealth of knowledge in this arena and puts it in ways that are, I think, more easily accessible. So he says, Zirizut, which is this idea of enthusiasm or alacrity, means you get out of bed as soon as you get up, that should say. Sorry about that. It means you don't delay to do what needs to be done, what ought to be done, and what can be done. There's no delay. There's no procrastination. Your alarm goes off. There's no snooze button. You jump out of bed and you are ready to start your day. I don't know about you, but that doesn't happen often in my house. But that's what enthusiasm, that's the kind of enthusiasm that he's talking about. And if we're able to start our day each morning like that, what a wonderful thing, so long as we're not putting ourselves in positions where we could be going over the top, right? Another really important text specifically for this midah is Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, who wrote a lot about this in his book, The Path of the Just. So you're going to see that I have a few different quotes from him that I brought in for today. This first one is, the angels were praised for this good trait, zirizut. As it is said regarding them, they are mighty in energy, doing as God says, listening to the voice of God's word. And as it is written, the chayot, or the heavenly beings, referring to the angels, dashed back and forth like lightning. In truth, human beings are just that, humans, and not angels. It is therefore impossible for us to have the might of the angels. Nonetheless, we should strive to get as close to that level as we possibly can. King David used to praise his own share of this trait by saying, I hurried, I did not delay to keep your mitzvot. So we see here this idea of enthusiasm as a really positive thing. That doesn't negate everything we're saying, by the way, about keeping it in check. And part of this is actually, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, why are the angels being thanked, not Abraham? Who's actually doing the task? I'm a little confused here. Maybe I wasn't listening as well.
No, this is a text that's talking about the midah, or the soul trait of enthusiasm. So this isn't about Abraham. This is just learning more about that soul trait to go back to our original text.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
I even like the sound of that word. It sounds enthusiastic.
What, Zerizut?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's fun to say.
Yeah.
I like it too.
Okay, so the text that we just read is in part based on this source, which comes from the Talmud Bavli, 5th-ish century, that it was put together. And it says, unless you say that this halacha is in accordance with the principle that the vigilant are early in the performance of mitzvot, let us search in the morning. So it's basically saying, there's this idea that'll come up about doing something earlier in the day because it shows that you're enthusiastic to do it if you do it earlier in the day. But this first line is just saying it doesn't have to be at the crack of dawn. It should just be in the morning. So it says the principle, the vigilant are early in the performance of mitzvot, is derived as it is written. And on the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskins shall be circumcised. It was taught in a Baraita, which is a 12th century text. The entire day is suitable for the performance of the mitzvah of circumcision. In fact, from here, I'm going to be going to a circumcision in our community of a little adorable boy. However, the vigilant are early in the performance of mitzvot and circumcised in the morning. As it is stated, with regard to the binding of Isaac, and Abraham arose early in the morning after hearing God's command. This indicates that Abraham arose early in his eagerness to perform God's commandments. So it's using this idea, as we had in all of these different texts, of going someplace in the morning to show a kind of enthusiasm, a desire to do God's mitzvot.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
But there is no mitzvah to sacrifice your child.
There certainly is not. Right. And we're going to go to that one in a second, because that is, I think, an example of Abraham perhaps not thinking things through. To say the least. We may want
to sacrifice our children at times in their life, but I don't think it's commanded.
There's a few commands against it, I would say. But before we get to that one, because it's a really, really good point, and it's a complicated point, it's a really complicated story on so many different levels. I just want to get us through this idea of enthusiasm, because Rabbi Luzzatto, in his book, The Path of the Just, same book that we quoted a minute ago, he has an entire chapter within that book on this particular soul trait. And what he says is that this enthusiasm has an enemy, and that enemy is laziness. And that's what he brings in. Rabbi Luzzatto, like many Musar teachers, associates laziness with our physicality. If we were pure spirit, we'd be light and active. But because we live in bodies, we are tied to the physical world and controlled by the force of gravity and are pulled down. These are facts of nature that Rabbi Luzzatto does not deny, but he cautions. If you abandon yourself to this heaviness, you will not succeed in your quest. The Hebrew for heavy is kaved. This word also shows up prominently in the story of Moses' attempts to get Pharaoh to release the children of Israel from Egypt. There we read that Pharaoh refused to pay attention to Moses' entreaties because his heart was kaved, usually translated as obstinate or stubborn. Here too, we get an image that helps us understand what it is to be heavy. It means to run counter to the way of the spirit. So perhaps there are things about which we are very enthusiastic, but we feel weighed down and we're not able to act on that enthusiasm. That's what Rabbi Luzzatto is trying to get to.
So one question I have, because it says it means to run counter to the way of the spirit. In the case of the story of Exodus, God makes Pharaoh's heart heavy over and over again. So I don't know if this is exactly counter to the way of the spirit, because it's, literally divinely caused.
Yeah, it is and it isn't. So this is a text study for later on when we get to this. But if you look at the actual text, early on, it doesn't say that God caused anything to be heavy. It doesn't attribute that to God until fairly far on within the text. So the idea there that some people bring forth is that he made his own heart heavy, and then after a while became so stuck there. And that's when it said that God made him heavy. And there's so many debates and so much deeper stuff to get into there. A lot of food for thought, to be sure.
I'd like to say that, in my opinion, enthusiasm or the lack of it is a matter of free will and choice. So if we choose to be rather than lazy, then we can, feel, the will of God or the energy or the spirit of God within us to do good, to do right. It is free choice if we can reach into ourselves to do it.
Yeah, but we have to have that. We need to push for it, right?
Well, it's easier to be lazy at times, speaking for myself, than to be enthusiastic.
Yeah, and that's exactly what he's getting to, is that at times we might actually want to be enthusiastic, but we feel weighed down and it's hard getting over that weight.
And that's why the first thing in the morning is when we're supposed to be most awake to do it. Going back
Right.
to the previous.
If you just get going, you jump out of bed and you get going on something, perhaps that's a way to get out. I mean, that's the idea that's put forth here.
Right.
We don't have to agree with it, but that's just the idea that they're putting forth. And there's a couple other things that I want to just quickly get through. Well, Edmund Burke's fairly famous quote that the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. This idea that we could fall in a place of laziness, but let's not do it, right? Because if we do nothing, that is what allows for the triumph of evil in the world. But the other things that I just wanted to kind of go back to is, again, going to Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, where he talks about justification. And there's this really fascinating text that comes up in a few different places, that sometimes we could feel that heaviness, and we can actually justify our lack of action. And that's what he talks to here. So if one says to him, your teacher is in the city, go and learn Torah from him, he answers, I'm afraid of the lion on the road. And if it is written, as it is written, the lazy man says, there is a lion in the way. If they say to him, your teacher is already in the province, go up and go to him, meaning you don't have to go by the lion. He says, but I'm afraid that a lion might be in the streets. As it is written, a lion on the streets. If they say to him, he is lodging right near your house, he answers, but the lion is right outside. As it is written, the lazy man says, there is a lion outside. I shall be slaughtered in the middle of the streets. If they say to him, he is in the building, he answers, and if I go and find the door locked, I'll have to return. They say to him, it is open, but still will not get up. As it is written, the door is swinging on its hinges and the lazy man is on his bed. In the end, not knowing what to answer, he says to them, whether the door is open or locked, I want to sleep a little more. As it is written, how long will you sleep, lazy man? When will you rise from your sleep? So just kind of pushing us that maybe there are times where we might justify our lack of enthusiasm and we're not enthusiastic enough. And perhaps we have to, at that moment, work on ourselves to be more enthusiastic. Right? That's one side of things, is if we don't have enough enthusiasm. And sometimes that lack of enthusiasm is actually because of clinical depression and other things, or we really need to have medical help because it's an illness, right? And sometimes it's just that we don't want to move, and only we know that. And pushing us on that side of things. Alan Marinas, again, I'm throwing this in. The heart wants to be inspired. And the first step to becoming inspired in a positive spiritual way is to become aware of the pitfalls we are likely to meet on that way. That will help us to avoid them. Laziness is the obstacle Rabbi Luzzatto points out to us, and his guidance coincides with experience and common sense. Nothing could be farther from inspiration than laziness. Watch out for laziness. Sort out what is true and what is false in your aspirations. Be alert to catch the voice of rationalization when it pipes up. This is how you clear the road to Zerezut.
You know, Rabbi, I was just thinking, my mind went back to the height of the COVID time. And, you know, we saw on television the ultra-Orthodox dancing in the streets, or, you know, having ceremonies and whatever. And the COVID virus was like the lion outside. I mean, they participated in demonstrations for themselves, regardless of the perhaps danger. I'm not saying it was smart to do that, but maybe they were thinking about some of these passages about the lion in the street and the fact that they still wanted to be enthusiastic about their study of Torah.
Right. And then it gets to a question of, when does Zerezut go too far?
Exactly.
because maybe it is appropriate to think things through. Maybe sometimes we need to hold on to that enthusiasm, right? It's not about always being enthusiastic. It's about being thoughtful in where we use our enthusiasm.
Thank you. Yeah.
Any other thoughts before we go to this section that speaks a bit more to what Marla brought up before and to what Karen brought up before?
I always feel kind of like, so what about us night owls that don't really get going and really get inspired the closer the midnight it is? I mean, I have to put in a vote for us there.
Right. I mean, that was talking about morning, but I don't know that enthusiasm is a specific time of day, right?
Right.
I agree with that.
Sorry, was there someone who wanted to say something else?
I just agreed with the comment.
Oh, okay. I can't see everyone, so I don't, sorry. So let's look at this text. There's two more that come in, and these are both in this week's Torah portion. There's just so much here. So this is a story that actually, it occurs a few times in our Torah, and it's kind of a challenging one. But Abraham said of Sarah, his wife, she is my sister. So King Abimelech of Gerar had Sarah brought to him. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, you are to die because of the woman that you have taken, for she is a married woman. So essentially, Abraham was afraid because Sarah was so beautiful that if they knew that Abraham was her husband, that perhaps they would kill him in order to be able to marry her. So asked for this lie to be told, or some say it's not really a lie, maybe they were related, whatever. Now Abimelech had not approached her. He said, oh God, will you slay people even though innocent? He himself said to me, she is my sister. And she also said, he is my brother. When I did this, my heart was blameless and my hands were clean. And God said to him in a dream, I knew that you did this with a blameless heart, so I kept you from sinning against me. That's why I did not let you touch her. Okay, so the comments here are about Abraham kind of jumping to say, oh, she's my sister, as opposed to, and potentially putting her in harm's way without maybe thinking things through a little bit more. And Rabbi Alexander Shulal Wiener in this commentary that we have today, in the Musar Torah commentary, speaks to that. Does anyone want to read these sentences?
I can.
Rabbi, oh, sorry.
Thanks, sir. That'd be great.
Okay. Repeating a defensive action he had taken years earlier, Genesis 12, Abraham presents Sarah to the king as his sister, acting with too much zizut. Abraham quickly thinks to save his own life at the risk of Sarah's being raped. Genesis 22. God appeared to Abimelech in a dream, commanding him to restore Sarah to Abraham as his wife. Genesis 23:3-7. On waking, Abimelech rebukes Abraham for putting him in a position of potential sin. What were you thinking of that you did this? In this situation, Abraham's own fear and mistrust of the unknown led him to act impetuously and without faith in the power and promise of God, with whom he has only recently engaged. I think this is a shoot from the hip kind of reaction that may be natural for anybody in that tense situation.
But it was self-serving. I mean,
yeah. It was, but
and maybe selfish.
And it mentions here he's only recently become a convert or attached to God.
Yeah, this is a very, very complicated story. It'll appear again in a couple of weeks from now, where Isaac does the exact same thing. And we have a bar mitzvah student that week, Adam Small, who wrote a Devar Torah on exactly this story and has some really beautiful insights. So I encourage you to listen to that. He's an incredible kid.
Rabbi, can I just please, what Abimelech says to God, oh Lord, will you slay people even though innocent? That's what Abraham says earlier.
There is definitely a parallel in the Hebrew too of exactly that.
And then God, and then when he wakes up, Abimelech says to Abraham, "What are you thinking of?" And God says that to Cain. Why did you do this? What were you thinking? Something like that. So there are echoes of prior events in this story.
Yeah, I don't know about the Hebrew connection with Cain. I would have to look at that. That's a really interesting connection. But here, the language with what Abraham says about Sodom and Gomorrah is almost exactly the same. Yeah, it's definitely speaking to that. And as a way of proving this point, right? Of sometimes you stand up and sometimes perhaps you don't. And it's the wisdom to know the difference, right?
Well, isn't that true? It's just like the Bert quote. It happens because people just remain quiet. But I've also heard the description in my past years that where humans are sort of bad weather animals, put up with things incrementally until they get to really become a burden, and then it's time to just that enough is enough, and that can relate to me in current terms. We have a group of people, our leaders, who are just remaining quiet with all the nonsense that went on, and eventually, suddenly, we're going to just say enough is enough. Let's get this. Stand up.
She forgets when people who talk too much, like her and Michael and Catherine.
Any other thoughts on this? That's great. Thank you so much, Herb, for bringing all of that in. Okay, then I want to bring in the final text here, which we've already kind of alluded to a few times, one of which is the story of the Akedah. So sometime afterwards, and we don't know after what, right? It's just in this long, long text. God put Abraham to the test. He said to him, "Abraham," and he answered, "Hinene, here I am." And he said, "Take your son, your favored one, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the heights that I will point out to you." So early next morning, Abraham saddled his ass and took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. He split the wood for the burnt offering, and he set out for the place of which God had told him. And the fact that he is asked to do this, there's not a word of conversation that we are privy to, but just early the next morning, V'yeschem Avraham baboker. He's up, he's going, all right, we're going to do what God told us to do. Shows his enthusiasm once more. So going back to our commentary for today, he spoke to exactly this, that it's true that one who works to cultivate zerezut must focus on the task with commitment. There are 3 aspects to completing a task: the enthusiastic start, the sustaining energy, and the perseverance to move forward, and finally, moving to successful completion. It's no wonder that the sages consider Abraham the paradigm of an ish zeriz, a man of alacrity, when considering the description of the Akedah. Still, the direction of Abraham's zerezut in the final chapters of the parashah contrasts to what we read earlier in the portion, leading us to moral consternation. Is it possible to become so meticulous in one's practice, so infused with zerezut, that we lose sight of the things that are most important? Thankfully, at the very last minute, with the knife poised above Isaac's head, we hear the divine call, "Abraham, Abraham, do not lay your hand on the lad, do nothing to him." Isaac is spared when an angel of God stops Abraham from going through with the sacrifice. So essentially, God is saying, here, enthusiasm was not necessarily such a good thing.
It also says to me that he is it's like a cult member. He's just going to believe whatever the power says, and he's going to act on that information. And just, you think I have to kill my son? I'm going to do it. And it's just over the top, which is the point, I guess.
That's good.
Yeah, and yet earlier he argued with God.
Mhm.
So it can definitely have us scratching our heads a little bit.
But why do you think there's so much packed into this week? I mean, what did the authors have in mind when they wanted so much information? I mean, you go to other parsha and go 3-4 pages before you get even one amount. We got one paragraph here.
It's a good question.
When I learned this as a youth, they just took a piece and then another piece, and I had no idea it was all packed into this till this week. I mean, till this part.
Yeah. There are some weeks where trying to find something to really dive into is harder. And this is a week where there's so much that it's hard just narrowing it down to one thing. Okay, I included one more text here, which is something that Rabbi Ted Reeder put together on this idea of enthusiasm. He said, in our zeal, do we run over other people, either physically or metaphorically? And that can mean ourselves as well, right? When we give too much, just like Harold was talking about, or miss out on important experiences or relationships. And our lack of enthusiasm, do we fail to follow through on commitments and let ourselves and others down? If either scenario sounds familiar, the next step is to identify areas in our daily lives where we can work on the opposite of our ingrained patterns. For instance, I might commit to pausing for 2 minutes every hour to do a simple self-check-in and to be present to the moment. On the other hand, I might take a simple list every day of the projects, phone calls, errands, or chores that I would like to complete. Oftentimes in Musar practice, we will even add a mantra to our daily routine or write key words on a Post-it to slow down or to light a fire.
We'll do that.
I like that.
So as we see from all of this, right, Musar is about truly being honest with ourselves. We don't need to share all of this with everyone else in the world, but it's about being really honest with ourselves, being aware of the times where we make excuses for ourselves and let ourselves off the hook, the times where we're pushing too far and maybe we need to step back a little bit, and to come up with a game plan of what can help us to be more balanced. So Marla, you raised all of these questions early on about how challenging this enthusiasm, this alacrity could be. And I'm kind of curious, now that we've gone through it, does this help in any way?
Yes, the learning was good for me today. Well, my takeaway is going to be that a portion of the work is to attain balance. And I think I was missing that notion, even though I'd heard it before, but I forgot about it. So that's my takeaway. In terms of myself, in full disclosure, there are times when my enthusiasm is stifled by another person because of their wisdom, perhaps. And sometimes I'm hurt by it. And then there are other times when I'm a grown-up and I say, oh yeah, that's right, I need to step back, I need to wait until this other piece of information comes forward or not. But I think I've also know that my instinct to do a mitzvah, to think of the other person and to be hospitable, if you will, if that's our takeaway, one of our things we're learning about. I'm not going to stifle that. I'm going to continue to be enthusiastic, but maybe it's okay to be a little cautious sometimes and to listen to other people's advice.
You may have counted yourself.
So having this kind of balance and how it is that we approach things within the context that we are in. Thank you,
me.
Marla, for sharing that. I just want to share these questions, and then I'm going to shut this down so we could just see each other for a couple of minutes. But ending with these 4 things that perhaps we might want to have on our minds. We are taught that if you have started a mitzvah, you should finish it. For a mitzvah is judged only upon its completion. How much enthusiasm and follow through do you bring to the tasks to which you commit yourself? Where in your avodah, your spiritual and practical work, can you bring more diligence, passion, enthusiasm, and task commitment? When might you need to step back and focus on self, on family, or other important relationships? Are you bringing the same level of zirezut to those relationships as you are to the external work? So any kind of thoughts or reflections as we close out today's class? Yeah, sorry.
I just think that this is so relevant, what we, became aware, well, not became aware, we are aware, but it reinforced for us about, really, being enthusiastic, following through, but with thoughtfulness and not overdoing it, and self-care, really. And being in the moment. So we're not so enthusiastic and that we're not even paying attention to what our body is saying or anything else or what's going on within the family. And so, and that's something I think we probably all work on every day. And so I think it's just so relevant. I mean, this is why I enjoy coming to the Torah study, because I always seem to be able to apply something that is so relevant to today, and it's just very uplifting for me, and it reinforces, a good way of living,
Thank you, Sari. Yeah. And I think Musar in particular is really helpful in that array.
I just have a quick comment.
Yeah.
I have an iWatch, and I think a Musar scholar was part of the programming team, because every hour or so it either tells me to get up or to sit down and take a deep breath, take a moment for yourself, and then even. So anyway, I have this constant reminder.
Yeah.
Sarah, I agree with what you said, and I think about, especially with the Musar study, because it's so personal. It's talking about ourselves, our characteristics. It's beautiful. It's magnificent.
Yeah.
And we can find teachers all around, right? I love that, Irv, the idea of the watch.
Cassi, I have a question.
Yeah.
It says at the beginning portion, God appeared to Abraham, and then there were 3 men who came. 2 angels went on to Sodom and Gomorrah. So many people have said God was among the 3 that appeared to Abraham.
I haven't seen Jewish texts that speak to that. That doesn't mean they don't exist, but I cannot think of any text within the Jewish tradition that speak to that.
Because God appeared to Abraham, it says, very first line.
Yeah, it does. And the idea that I've come across is that God appeared in the form of the angels, but not that God was an angel walking on earth.
Right.
That strikes me as a more Christian kind of way of looking at it. But if you see a text to the contrary, please share it.
Sure. I've seen it, but I don't remember where. Because only 2 angels go on to Sodom and